Fort Myers, Florida, an idyllic coastal town known for its sunshine and peaceful atmosphere. Brian Burns, 38 years old, a well-known real estate agent, and Carla Burns, 35 years old, a devoted mother, seemed like the perfect couple. But beneath the surface of this picturesque setting lies a chilling story, a story that would forever change the lives of a family, a community, and everyone who heard it. This is the case of Brian and Carla Burns, a case of betrayal, violence, and an unsettling mystery that still lingers. Before we dive into this case, we'd appreciate it if you could take a moment to like and subscribe. Your support means a lot. Let's get started. At first glance, the Burns family seemed to embody the perfect American dream. A loving couple, 2 beautiful children, and a picture-perfect home in sunny Fort Myers, Florida. On the surface, Brian and Carla Burns appeared to live a life that many envied. Successful careers, a strong family unit, and social outings that seemed to reflect happiness and stability. Their lives, often photographed and shared with friends, portrayed a sense of joy and completeness. But as we delve deeper, we begin to uncover the cracks in what seemed to be a flawless exterior. Brian Burns was a well-known real estate agent in the community, admired for his professionalism and charm. He was the type of person who could sell a house to anyone, with a reputation for making clients feel like family. Brian's confidence and polished demeanor made him the center of attention wherever he went, creating an aura of success that was hard to ignore. Carla Burns, his wife, was a dedicated mother and a familiar face in their children's lives. She was always involved in school events, PTA meetings, and the many family activities that seemed to define their busy household. Carla's role in the family was central. She was the caretaker, the organizer, the one who ensured that everything in their lives ran smoothly. Her devotion to her family was unwavering, and she worked tirelessly to create a warm and nurturing home for her children. Together, Brian and Carla had built what appeared to be the perfect life. They owned a beautiful home in a desirable neighborhood, surrounded by friends, family, and all the material comforts anyone could want. Their house was a reflection of their success, tastefully decorated, with framed photos of vacations and family milestones. It was the kind of home that made you believe everything inside was just as perfect as it seemed. Their children were the pride of the family, well-behaved, high-achieving, and the kind of kids parents like to brag about. They excelled in school, participated in extracurricular activities, and had a seemingly perfect upbringing. To anyone looking in from the outside, the Burns family was the ideal American family, content, successful, and happy. But as time went on, the picture-perfect life of the Burns family began to unravel. The cracks that had started to form in Brian and Carla's marriage slowly began to show. The pressures of raising 2 children, juggling careers, and trying to maintain an ideal family life began to take a toll on their relationship. What once seemed like a harmonious partnership was slowly being overshadowed by growing resentment and unresolved tension. Brian, consumed by his work, started to withdraw emotionally. His long hours and focus on his career left Carla feeling neglected and alone. The arguments between them became more frequent, and the love that once brought them together started to fade. As Carla struggled with the growing emotional distance, she began to feel more isolated, and the emotional strain of their crumbling marriage took its toll. Eventually, Carla made the difficult decision to end their marriage. What had once seemed like a strong and united family was now fractured, and the choice of divorce became unavoidable. But this was not the end of their problems. The tension between them only intensified in the months leading up to Carla's disappearance, as both grappled with the pain of an impending separation. February 15, 2015. A day that began like any other in the Burns household would soon become the start of a chilling mystery. Carla Burns, a devoted mother and wife, didn't show up for work that morning. To those who knew her, this was completely out of character. Carla was a woman who took her responsibilities seriously. She was punctual, dependable, and always in touch with her colleagues if something came up. But on this day, she was missing. It didn't take long for her family and friends to notice that something was wrong. Carla's mother, alarmed by her absence, reached out to her daughter's close friends and colleagues. Nobody had heard from Carla, and no one could explain her sudden disappearance. For Carla's closest friends, this silence was more than just worrying. It was deeply unsettling. In the days leading up to her disappearance, Carla had been in the process of finalizing her divorce with her husband, Brian. The couple had been separated for some time, but the emotional strain of the situation was taking its toll on both of them. It was known that Brian and Carla had met several times during this period to discuss the divorce proceedings, especially over the custody of their 2 children. Could this have been the cause of her sudden absence? Had the tension between them finally erupted into something more sinister? Carla's last known location was at Brian's house. She had gone there the evening before to discuss the final details of their divorce. But when family and friends tried to reach her on the morning of February 15th, there was no response. Her phone went straight to voicemail, and her car was parked outside Brian's house. The only thing missing was Carla herself. Brian, the last person to see Carla, initially claimed that she had left his house early that morning. He said that they had a brief discussion and that Carla had seemed upset, but nothing indicated that anything was wrong. According to Brian, Carla had left the house voluntarily, though no one could confirm where she had gone. This lack of clarity about Carla's whereabouts only fueled the suspicion surrounding her disappearance. As hours turned into days with no word from Carla, the worry quickly turned into panic. Friends and family members of Carla began to fear the worst, knowing that it was highly unlike her to simply disappear without any explanation. Law enforcement was contacted, and the investigation into Carla's disappearance began. Detectives quickly focused their attention on Brian Burns. He had been the last person to see Carla, and his statements about her departure from the house seemed vague and inconsistent. However, there was one significant detail that caught the attention of investigators. Brian was unusually calm. His lack of concern about Carla's disappearance stood in stark contrast to the panic that everyone else felt. Brian's odd behavior during interviews made the police begin to suspect that he knew more than he was letting on. As detectives began their investigation, they uncovered troubling clues that painted a picture of a marriage in turmoil. Brian and Carla's relationship had been rocky for some time, and the divorce proceedings had only intensified their emotional strain. The divorce had been difficult, and with both parties fighting for custody of their children, tensions had been at an all-time high. But the most unsettling discovery came when investigators began to examine the Burns family home. The blood evidence found inside the house raised serious concerns. There were signs of a violent struggle, with blood splatters in the garage and kitchen, places where Carla would not normally be. This blood was later confirmed to be Carla's, making it clear that something had gone terribly wrong in Brian's home. As the days passed with no sign of Carla Burns, the investigation took a decisive turn. Law enforcement's attention quickly turned toward Brian Burns, the last person known to have seen his estranged wife. While many might expect an anxious spouse, desperately trying to find their missing partner, Brian remained oddly calm and collected. His behavior began to raise red flags for investigators, and as the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together, the suspicion around him only grew. At first, Brian's statements were consistent. He claimed that Carla had come to his house the night before to discuss the divorce and their children. He said they had an emotional conversation, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He reported that Carla left early the next morning, though he didn't seem to know or care where she went. He offered no further explanation when asked about the details of their conversation or her sudden departure. But as investigators dug deeper into Brian's life, cracks began to appear in his story. His calm demeanor in the face of his wife's disappearance contrasted sharply with the panic felt by Carla's family and friends. While they were frantically searching for answers, Brian showed little to no concern. This behavior stood out to detectives, and they started to wonder if he was hiding something. Further scrutiny of Brian's whereabouts the night before Carla vanished revealed some inconsistencies. While Brian claimed that he and Carla had a relatively routine conversation, other evidence seemed to suggest otherwise. Neighbors reported hearing loud arguments coming from the Burns household in the days leading up to her disappearance. These disputes were said to be fueled by the tension over the divorce and custody arrangements. It became clear that there was more to the story than Brian had let on. As the investigation progressed, police learned that Brian had been involved in purchasing cleaning supplies in the days following Carla's disappearance. Surveillance footage from local stores showed him buying bleach, mops, and cleaning products, items that investigators later believed were used to clean up the aftermath of something far more sinister. These purchases, coupled with the blood found in his home, only deepened the suspicion surrounding Brian. In the wake of these discoveries, Brian's story began to unravel. Investigators found inconsistencies in his statements and behavior, prompting them to focus more intently on him as a prime suspect. Despite Brian's calm demeanor, the physical evidence suggested that something violent had occurred within his home. The blood evidence, which had been discovered in various areas of the house, including the garage and kitchen, pointed directly to Carla. Forensic analysis confirmed that the blood was hers. It was also determined that the blood had not been the result of an accident, but instead indicated a violent struggle had taken place. The evidence painted a picture of an altercation, one that ended with Carla in harm's way. Brian continued to deny any involvement in Carla's disappearance, but the mounting evidence painted a damning picture. Investigators began to focus on the possibility that Brian was not just an innocent bystander in his wife's disappearance, but rather the person responsible for her death. His failure to show genuine concern, coupled with the discovery of the bloodstains and cleaning supplies, pointed to a crime that had been meticulously covered up. As detectives pieced together the evidence, they began to suspect that Brian had not only been involved in Carla's disappearance but had played a significant role in her violent death. The question now was not just where Carla was, but how and why she had ended up in such a horrific situation. With this growing body of evidence, police began to prepare for an arrest. But one question loomed large: if Brian had indeed murdered Carla, what had motivated him to take such a drastic step? Was it the end of their tumultuous marriage, or was there something more, something darker, that had pushed him to violence? As the investigation deepened and more details emerged, the case against Brian Burns began to strengthen. The evidence was mounting, and detectives were no longer just looking for a missing person, they were looking for a murderer. As the investigation into Carla Burns' disappearance continued, the detectives began to uncover a series of unsettling clues, each one pointing closer to the truth. Despite Brian Burns' repeated denials of any involvement in his wife's disappearance, the evidence gathered from his home began to paint a troubling picture. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered key pieces of evidence that were hard to ignore, evidence that suggested Brian's role in what had happened to Carla. The most shocking of these discoveries came in the form of blood. Blood was found in several areas of the Burns home, including the garage, the kitchen, and in spots leading to the hallway. It wasn't just a trace amount, it was a significant amount of blood, indicating that Carla had been violently injured inside the home. Forensic experts quickly confirmed that the blood belonged to Carla Burns. While blood evidence in a home may be expected in some domestic disputes, this wasn't an accident. The bloodstains were not consistent with a simple cut or minor injury. They suggested a struggle, a violent confrontation between Carla and her estranged husband. Blood was found in areas that appeared to have been deliberately cleaned, areas where it was clear an attempt had been made to cover up what had occurred. Adding to the mounting suspicion were the purchases made by Brian in the days following Carla's disappearance. Surveillance footage from local stores showed Brian buying a variety of cleaning supplies, mops, bleach, and other cleaning products that seemed oddly specific. These items were typically used to erase evidence, and the timing of the purchases raised more questions about what had transpired inside his home. At first glance, these items may have seemed like an innocent errand. But when viewed in conjunction with the blood evidence found at the house, they began to paint a far more sinister picture. It seemed that Brian had made efforts to clean up after something violent, and that something was more than likely the brutal assault on his wife. The bloodstains in the garage and kitchen indicated that the attack was likely not a spur-of-the-moment act. Instead, It seemed like the result of an intentional and violent altercation. Forensic experts testified that the pattern of the blood suggested that Carla had been injured in one part of the house, possibly the kitchen, and then moved to another location, likely the garage, where the struggle may have continued. But it wasn't just the blood evidence and cleaning supplies that suggested foul play. There were also signs of an attempt to hide the crime. In the days after Carla's disappearance, neighbors and friends noted Brian's unusual behavior. He remained uncharacteristically calm, and his actions suggested that he was more concerned with covering his tracks than with finding his missing wife. Even more disturbing was the absence of Carla's body. Despite extensive searches, there was no trace of her anywhere. The police now had to face the grim reality. While the blood evidence pointed to violence, Carla's body had vanished, leaving them with a chilling mystery. Where was she? Had Brian disposed of her in a way that left no trace? As investigators continued to sift through the evidence, the disturbing picture began to solidify. Brian Burns was no longer just a concerned husband looking for his missing wife. He was the prime suspect in a violent crime. With blood evidence in his home, cleaning supplies found in his possession, and no sign of Carla, the case was rapidly becoming a murder investigation. On February 20, 2015, just 5 days after Carla Burns was reported missing, Brian Burns was taken into custody. His arrest, although expected, sent shockwaves through the community. For weeks, investigators had been gathering overwhelming evidence: bloodstains in his home, surveillance footage showing suspicious purchases, and his cold demeanor during the investigation. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, Brian had continued to deny any involvement in his wife's disappearance. The decision to arrest Brian was not taken lightly. Police had carefully examined all the evidence, and it had become undeniable that something violent had occurred inside his home. Blood belonging to Carla was found in multiple rooms of the house, and forensic experts had testified that the blood pattern suggested a violent struggle. Additionally, Brian's odd behavior during the investigation, including his lack of concern for his wife's safety and his uncharacteristic calmness, raised further suspicions. But it wasn't just the forensic evidence that sealed his fate. The timing of Brian's actions was telling. Surveillance footage showed him purchasing cleaning supplies immediately after Carla's disappearance. There was also the matter of his conflicting statements during police interviews, one moment appearing to cooperate, the next becoming increasingly defensive. His behavior seemed almost as if he was trying to cover something up. When Brian was arrested, his expression remained impassive. There was no sign of the typical emotion that one might expect from someone facing the loss of their spouse. The arrest took place early in the morning at his home, and as he was escorted to the police car, neighbors and onlookers gathered in shock. Many were still struggling to comprehend that a man they once knew as a respectable member of the community was now a suspect in his wife's likely murder. As Brian was read his rights and placed in handcuffs, he continued to maintain his innocence. He claimed that he had nothing to do with Carla's disappearance, and that he loved her despite their marital troubles. However, the mounting evidence left little room for doubt. Brian Burns had become the prime suspect in a case that had gripped the local community. After his arrest, Brian was held at the Lee County Jail, awaiting charges. His arrest marked a significant turning point in the case. Carla's family, who had been desperately searching for answers, were left with a mixture of emotions: relief that the person responsible for her disappearance was in custody, but also frustration and grief that the circumstances surrounding her death were still unclear. In the days following his arrest, Brian's defense team began to prepare for what would become a high-profile trial. Despite his arrest, the authorities had yet to find Carla's body, and Brian continued to claim his innocence. But for investigators, the arrest was just the beginning of a long and complex journey toward justice. The trial of Brian Burns began in 2017, nearly 2 years after his arrest. The courtroom was filled with tension as both sides prepared their cases. Carla Burns' family sat in anticipation for answers, while Brian's defense team braced for the challenge ahead. The prosecution began with strong evidence. Blood stains found in multiple locations inside the Burns home were presented as evidence of a violent altercation. Forensic experts testified that the pattern of blood suggested a fatal event. Most significantly, blood belonging to Carla Burns was found where she should not have been. Further evidence pointed to Brian's suspicious behavior. Surveillance footage showed him buying cleaning supplies immediately after Carla disappeared. Neighbors and friends described a troubled marriage, with Carla planning to leave Brian, adding weight to the motive. The defense aimed to undermine the case, claiming no definitive proof of murder existed. They argued the blood could have been from an accident, and without a body, there was no clear motive for murder. Despite this, the prosecution's case remained strong. Forensic experts explained how the blood stains and patterns suggested foul play. Although the body was missing, the accumulation of circumstantial evidence painted a clear picture of Brian's guilt. As closing arguments approached, the prosecution argued that while the body was absent, the totality of the evidence was undeniable. The defense, however, asked the jury to consider reasonable doubt. After deliberation, the jury found Brian Burns guilty of second-degree murder. The sentence, life without parole, brought no closure for Carla's family, who would continue to mourn her loss. The trial concluded, but the unanswered questions about Carla's death would linger forever. After weeks of gripping testimony and intense deliberations, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty. Brian Burns was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of his estranged wife, Carla Burns. The courtroom, once filled with the tension of the trial, fell silent as the judge announced the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Carla's family, the verdict was bittersweet. While justice had been served in the legal sense, it could never bring Carla back. Her children would grow up without their mother, and her loved ones would forever be haunted by the fact that her body was still missing, a cruel reminder of the unanswered questions surrounding her death. The moment the verdict was read, Carla's family members, many of whom had endured the painful days of searching and waiting, exhaled a collective sigh of relief. The years of anguish, confusion, and doubt were finally met with some form of justice. However, as the court proceedings came to a close, the harsh reality of Carla's disappearance still lingered. No one could say goodbye properly, as her remains were never recovered. For her family, that was the hardest part. Finding peace when the final chapter of her story could never be written in full. Though Brian Burns had been convicted, the tragedy of Carla's loss could never be erased. For her family and friends, the verdict would never be enough to fill the void left by her absence. And so, while Brian Burns now faces life behind bars, the true cost of his actions extends far beyond the courtroom, affecting not just his own future, but the future of those who loved Carla. Her children, her friends, and her family, who will continue to remember the woman they lost, but will never truly forget. Carla Burns was more than just a victim. She was a mother, a daughter, and a friend. Her life was cut short, but her story lives on as a stark reminder of the dangers of domestic violence, and the dark truths that can hide behind the most polished facades. Though Brian Burns was sentenced, Carla's family has never stopped searching for the final answers. Without a body, they could not say goodbye. The haunting unknown remains. Carla Burns' story is one of love, betrayal, and unimaginable loss. It's a story that reminds us that appearances can be deceiving, and that behind closed doors, darkness can take hold. As we close this chapter, we honor Carla's memory. Her story is not just one of tragedy, but of hope, a call to action for those who need help and for those who can offer it. Carla Burns may no longer be with us, but her legacy will continue to inspire us all to fight against domestic violence. Share your thoughts on this heartbreaking case in the comments below and the lessons it teaches.